think the appropriate term is as you were. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And welcome also to our distinguished panel. My name is Dutch Leonard, and I'm going to be the moderator for tonight's discussion, which is going to focus on the ongoing development of doctrine and approaches and structures and methods for cooperation between military organizations and many other organizations, civilian, state agencies, and others, both in the homeland in the U.S. and also in other settings abroad. We have a very distinguished panel with us this evening who has had a long history of different perspectives on this set of issues, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. But I also wanted to observe we have a very distinguished audience here this evening. Of course, all audiences at the Kennedy School are very distinguished, but this one is a particularly distinguished audience. Here we have a number of people who are participants currently in our program for general and flag officers and associated and affiliated agencies who are here from the Coast Guard and the National Guard Bureau and other agencies to help us think about how to develop the backbone and cadre of leadership that we're going to need in whatever the next event is that the United States faces in our future. We are also delighted to have with us this evening a number of people who are here for a program on disaster management in South Asia. So these are senior officials from a variety of countries in South Asia who are involved with emergency management there and involved in discussions here about different ideas and approaches and also about collaboration across within their countries and across national borders and boundaries. I don't think we've ever assembled quite this level of expertise, sort of collective knowledge around this topic in this room ever before. So I find it a little daunting, and I think I warned my panelists that we can expect some very well-informed questions. So our topic this evening is to focus on the ongoing future success of our ability to deal with what we refer to as landscape-scale disasters, very large, very complex situations. And the hope is that we are moving toward greater success in those events. The U.S. Armed Services famously has a very long list of really important assets that can be helpful in that regard. People with particular skills, equipment, resources, mobility resources, the ability to do lots of really important things, incredible list of valuable assets for deployment in those disaster circumstances. But the ability to deploy those assets smoothly and in coordination with many other players has not always been historically, shall we say, pretty. And a number of people have worked over time to try to improve the capacity to interact successfully with all the other organizations that are involved in these major events. And the three people with us this evening are among the people who've been working on that. And if we make appropriate progress, we will all sleep better knowing that we'll have an even more effective response next time we have an event. So we have a distinguished panel to help us think about this. I'm going to turn first to General Craig McKinley, who's the chief of the U.S. National Guard Bureau and the newest member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Congratulations, General. He's had a very long and distinguished career as an Air Force officer, including a command pilot in various aircraft, including the F-16 and the F-15, which I always find a little surprising since he looms over me when we talk. Did you have a custom airplane, sir, that was built around you? Yes, I thought they might have had to do that. He now serves as the chief of the U.S. National Guard Bureau, and in this role he has been among the people who's been trying to help figure out what the appropriate doctrine is for a whole-of-government response to a whole-of-government and, in fact, whole-of-society response to very large-scale disasters. So, General, I thought we'd turn first to you. You've had experience with a number of these kinds of events. So tell us about where that concept is today, how it's evolving, and what you see as the status of our efforts to provide a useful synthesis, if you will, of these different powers.
Thanks, Professor Leonard. It's great to be with everybody, and I'm ably assisted tonight with a number of what I proudly refer to as my board of directors, the adjutants generals of the states, territories, and the districts. So I hope none of them ask me too tough questions, because I do have some appraisals on my desk back home. Like I appraise the governor's people here. It's great to be with you tonight, Dutch. This is my second opportunity to be at Harvard, and great vision by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, represented tonight by their acting Adjutant General Scott Rice and his wife Nancy. and another great group of folks in the room too. But Joe Carter and others, General Olstrom, yourself, we've all worked hard on bringing together this kind of a think group who can come together, discuss these very important issues, and what a great opportunity tonight with international partners to be here with you all tonight too. We look forward to your questions. They do anyway, I don't. Really, quite simply, Major General Pete Aylward and I, and Pete's one of our sharp thinkers in the National Guard Bureau, have really seen an evolution in time over the whole of government approach to response to natural disasters. In our particular case, with our states, we call it kind of a centralized approach to funding, resourcing, and equipping, and the adjutants general really, on behalf of their governors, are the execution phase for most natural disasters. The ratios around 94–95% of our natural disasters events in our states and our territories are handled by local first responders, our police and fire. Joe Pfeiffer, thanks for being here. And we assist when we're called by the governors to assist that initial response. I think since September 11th, 2001, the ante is up, obviously, and we have to be prepared to go full spectrum operations with natural disasters here at home, as well as man-made events. So the whole of government approach, ably working with FEMA and Craig Fugate, who's a very close partner to the National Guard and all of us. We've made great progress, strides. There are still gaps and seams, which I'm sure we'll explore in our discussion tonight, because that's the interesting part of how do we continue to improve and build. But we've made great progress, and along with my colleagues here tonight, I'm sure we'll see how close we've become as agency partners. So thanks for that introduction. Great to be with you.
Well, General, you've, during your watch as chief, you've been involved, and your agencies have been involved in both domestic and international events. So, for example, there was a substantial National Guard response in Haiti. There was support for various operations in the Japanese 3/11 event.
Sure.
Do you find that and you also had just recently in this region, Hurricane Irene last fall, plus a number of other domestic events. Do you find the concept of whole of government working pretty much the same way in these different settings, internationally and domestically, or is it a whole different set of issues and concerns?
I think we're using a new rule set book. I think with Admiral Landry and what she pioneered down with Deepwater Horizons, we've made significant improvements in the way we present our force. I will brag a little bit about our Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Sandy Winterfield, who was one of our panelists here last year. Right. He, as Commander of the United States Northern Command, in association with our Adjutant General and the governors who crafted a decision document that allows for unity of effort with command, solved a major problem in our efforts to bring whole of government to a crisis. The dual status command model allows the governor of the state or territory to have a National Guard man or woman in charge of an event in the arena and work with Title X, with interagency partners to represent the interests of the sovereign governor of the state. Now that was a huge symbolic effort, and we'll talk a little bit about Haiti, which was another example of how the National Guard was postured and ready to support Haiti, but because it was outside our continental borders, we had limitations to putting National Guard men and women in the response. And Major General Kelly McKeag, who's here, who's our advisor to the chairman, worked very hard to try to set the conditions to say that the National Guard is prepared for out-of-country events as well as in-country events. That's an area that we still need to explore, but I'll give great credit to Admiral Landry for how she worked an offshore event, quite frankly, with Deepwater, and involved whole of government without the seams or the gaps that sometimes befall those types of events.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great characterization, both of the plus side and of the work that remains. So maybe we can come back to that in our discussions a little bit later. So let's turn to Admiral Landry. Admiral Mary Landry retired from a very distinguished career as a Coast Guard admiral, only to be recalled and pressed back into service in the Coast Guard and at DHS as a senior executive service member and the director of incident management and preparedness policy. This is as a result of the fact that there were discoveries during Deepwater Horizon that there is some policy yet to be developed here, that the doctrine is silent on some of the things that turn out to be really important. Over the course of her career, she's been involved in a whole series of events of different scale as a Coast Guard officer, and finally culminating in being the federal coordinating official and on-scene coordinator for the first 6 weeks of the Deepwater Horizon incident as the district commander of the Coast Guard in that region. Admiral Landry, could you tell us a little bit about how that event evolved and what you saw as the plus side of the whole of government ability to respond, but also some of the things you saw that we still need to work on?
Thanks, Dutch. And General McKinley, thank you for the notation. But I have to tell you that I look at my glass, and it could be glass half empty or glass half full, as you say, because we have made great progress. I see many of the tags in the room that I've met before. Before Deepwater Horizon, we all knew each other. We knew each other because since 9/11, there has been what I would call an evolution of preparedness for a serious incident in the United States. And we worked the Democratic National Convention here, and I was in the Volpe Center, and there were discussions between the National Guard Bureau and the Department of Defense. How will we balance Title 32, Title 10? How will we integrate these capabilities? And I looked at this suite of capabilities and said, may we never have to use it, because you prefer to prepare for things and be ready and not have things happen. We continued on with work in Katrina. We learned a tremendous amount in this country from Katrina. And when 9/11 happened in Katrina, we became a part of Department of Homeland Security. The Coast Guard moved from the Department of Transportation to the Department of Homeland Security, simultaneous with the Department of Defense standing up NORTHCOM. Many of you know this, but for the others in the room who may not be familiar, this has been an evolutionary process for this country. So General McKinley and I met right after Haiti, when we were having an annual meeting of the National Guard, all the tags, the Coast Guard, the FEMA was there, the Department of Homeland Security, and we meet annually before hurricane season to identify what could possibly happen, what might be the gaps for the states, how may we be called into service. So General McKinley and I met. I applauded the work they had done in Haiti. One great example was airspace deconfliction. They went from landing 10 or 20 planes to landing over 100 in the same amount of time. This is important for bringing goods. In that course of that meeting, I went to down to Tyndall Air Force Base, and I discovered how that capability was exercised in Haiti and used in Haiti. When Deepwater Horizon occurred, this was, to me, I don't think our country has ever brought that capacity to bear to the full scale and scope of what we did in Deepwater Horizon. It was a full integration of federal, state, local, private sector, academic institutions, Dutch was down there, and Department of State coordinated with foreign governments for how they could assist us. So this was a full-scale event. In the first few days, I was in a room we were on the phone with the White House, the Secretary of Defense was on the phone, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all the cabinet level secretaries, and there was a big discussion about, is this a Stafford Act standard crisis like we have in hurricanes where we will support the states? Well, we have a law in this country called the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 that was a result of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, where the responsible party, the private sector, bears the burden to pay for that response and get the assets rolling, and we are in a role of overseeing to make sure they do what they're supposed to do and coordinating the capabilities that the private sector might not be able to bring to bear. I think we were all surprised in that process of a company as large as BP and global company with all the resources they have struggled and needed help beyond their own private sector capabilities. And we were fortunate to have the National Guard activated, the reserves activated. It was very much the support of a whole of government private sector. And I think we have never gotten that far in this country to the capacity that was brought to bear. And there were many things that were novel in scope that even though we had practiced and talked about them, when you go to execute them, they were extremely challenging. So I would say the glass is half full or half empty, however you'd like to look at it. We still have a long way to go, but I was never more proud. I told people in the room, you are all part of creating a national good. because to bring this together, what we did, and to bring these capabilities and work through the things we had to work through is a national good that is very important. May we never have to use it again in the future, but we are evolving and continuing.
Well, thank you, Admiral Landry. Part of the issue you raise is something we've been talking about in both of these programs over the course of this week, which is if you think about what you just said about the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, it imagines that this is in effect going to be a routine-sized spill and a routine-sized problem that a company like BP could reasonably be expected to handle. Well, this was an historic-sized spill. It was way beyond the threshold of what people had imagined we would have to deal with. And as a result, it required a whole different kind of response, which hadn't really been contemplated. So you faced the problem of trying to assemble that response, even with the restraints that it had to be under the supposed burden, as you said, of the private sector. So that must have added to your difficulties in those early weeks.
We had a foundation. We had a foundation from the work of the national response team, the regional response teams, all the work this country had done since OPA 90 and Exxon Valdez. But that envisioned a tank ship or a facility. It didn't really envision the size and scale of what this was all about. And I could tell you that also there were so many things that were novel that even in this capabilities piece of how do we respond to crisis, how does NORTHCOM support civil authorities in a crisis? So I would say that it provided us an opportunity to use the basics that we had all been working on for a long time. I had also worked pandemic preparedness because we were concerned about avian flu and other things. We worked on many things together collectively, and this was a chance to put it into practice. Just one example of novel in scope, though, we were eclipsing the dollar figure I was allowed. Each incident, you can go to 123 million. We were having to pay all these things up front. We quickly exceeded 123 million. Had to go to Congress to ask for more funding. By the time the government got to 123 million, the responsible party was at 900 million. So we were at $1 billion, and that happened very quickly. And we had to go and get authorization to go further because we knew we needed more. That's just one example of how you all of a sudden are eclipsing anything in scale and scope than was envisioned before. And I'm just really proud of the people that had to work through the policy issues, the actual mechanics, the authorizations, how to work through the legal aspects. All those things had to be thought of on the fly. I mean, basically, as we go. And that was very challenging.
So the challenge of improvising in this setting where the things we had contemplated were of a much different scale and a much lower level of complexity means that you as a leader are suddenly plunged into a highly uncertain environment with enormous amounts of pressure without a lot to grow on, having to try to improvise those collaborations and so on. So maybe we can come back actually to this, because I think this points to one of the areas where we just haven't thought enough about how to cope with that scale and level of complexity, and maybe we can direct some of our attention further to that. Well, finally, I'd like to turn to General Julie Bentz, who has a long and distinguished career that has particularly emphasized challenges that had to do with significant components of scientific knowledge and issues, for example, like nuclear events, in which she has a particular expertise, including most recently the nuclear aftermath of the Japanese 3/11 event, as Fukushima began, the nuclear power plant at Fukushima began to have difficulties. She viewed that particular event from the perspective of the White House, where she experienced a series of issues that were, on the one hand, political, and then multiple different interests involved, multiple different U.S. interests involved, and, of course, the interests of many other parties in the event. So, General Bentz, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that evolved and how in an international setting, these issues played out, and how that felt for the people who, like you, were trying to manage it.
You bet. In fact, thank you so much. It's delightful to be here. The response to Fukushima was an interesting community where the Japanese, first off, we were so thankful that it was Japan, right? Good friends, good partners, totally capable of, if a reactor was going to go up anywhere, God forbid it ever happen again, but Japan had all the capability necessary to deal with that. And so we launched out in a very typical fashion the support that the Department of State gives humanitarian assistance, disaster response. They pulled together a disaster assistance response team, the DART, that goes overseas for any kind of humanitarian aid where we can be of assistance. And we learned very quickly that, you know, the technical capability that we had to push out with the DART were folks that didn't traditionally go out. So a lot of our nuclear response capability was launching forward. And the Department of State, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and in their Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, they look particularly at supporting the government of Japan, right? The government they go to, that's who they support, and the needs of that government. What was interesting in the response to Fukushima is that we also had a very large component of American citizens in Japan. We have 160,000 Americans who live on the islands of Japan. And many of those are the Department of Defense dependents, families, civilians, sailors, soldiers. And so the Department of Defense actually had a lot of interest and concern about what was happening in Japan outside the humanitarian assistance and disaster response. But then with the cloud, the plume coming you know, off the reactor, people in the West Coast very, very concerned about what was coming their way. All of the folks in our territories and islands around Fukushima also very concerned. So if you look at those three populations that we were working with, you realize that they all had different owners or different communities that were responsible for them, right? The humanitarian assistance run out of Department of State. The defense dependents and those folks, a concern of Department of Defense. And the folks out in the territories and our governors, the responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security. So very early on, just the messaging to make sure that you know, there's the one face, one fight, because it's a single plume, it's a single crisis, just looked at from different populations. That was a very interesting and unique problem set that we dealt with. You know, the second thing that was very challenging in the response was that it was just so incredibly technical, and the data really intimidated leadership. The folks making decisions, I mean, it was a simple question that they asked the technical community. Are we looking at 3 Mile Island, or are we looking at Chernobyl? Right? And it took us a while, the technical community, to realize, no, really, it's that simple question, which is an incredibly complex and difficult question to answer from a technical perspective. But you would think that's kind of easy. What we were up against was a catastrophe unlike any we've ever seen, and that was multiple reactors that were having their, you know, it wasn't a single point failure. You had kind of a linear accumulated effect, which we've never modeled. And a lot of our capability at the time was being stressed in a way that we hadn't thought about before. So that was a really unique challenge. The other thing that was very interesting for me, because I came into the military right when Chernobyl happened, so as a very young second lieutenant, I was working in Europe in the response to Chernobyl. And one of the things that DoD has a lot of is capability. But our nuclear capability is built around two realities. The first one is our nuclear navy. So again, thank goodness we had a very large footprint of the nuclear navy there around Japan, which is very, very useful. But the other one is the Cold War doctrine of the response of being able to fight in a nuclear battlefield. Well, that doctrine's gone away. And so a lot of that capability is kind of old school. And so for some of the old timers to be able to pull that capability up and out, which still exists because it's a useful capability, and push it forward was quite a challenge, because we were retraining people on capability that only a very few people at kind of, you know, the captain major level had an awareness that it existed. So that was a very also intriguing response. Now, I will tell you, anything that got over there went on DoD airframes. You know, all the manifests that got over there was it was well coordinated out of PACOM and the Department of State. And we pulled in about all the capability we had. And it was also a time to realize, you know, for these once-in-a-generation events, we do have capability, but it's not very deep. It's a thin capability. And at some point in time, we challenge that capability. We stretch it to kind of its limits. And you know, a question for the technical community is, you know, what capacity is the correct capacity if it's a once-in-a-generation kind of event? So anyway.
So thank you, General Bentz. There's I think across the panel here, a very interesting characterization of what these events look like. Different events, but here's some of the features I picked up on in your discussion. General McKinley observes that in these kinds of very large-scale and complex events, they're going to require a decentralized but coordinated response. So that's an area where we might need to think a little bit more ahead of time about how we can create a unity of effort when we're going to do things on a highly decentralized basis, especially as Admiral Landry's pointed out to us, when we're decentralizing into an environment that has a lot of different players with different sovereignty. So you have state governments and federal government and local governments, which in Louisiana also think they're sovereign. So a very complex landscape in that respect. So that's one feature of it. Second, as Admiral Landry said, the BP oil spill was being conducted, or a response to it was being conducted in a setting where we had thought about relatively small scale and handled lots of small scale oil spills, but this was way over that threshold. And the structure of the law didn't really contemplate what you would do in that kind of event. So you basically had to improvise and make that up as you went along. And you also observe it was hugely more complex than we had imagined the things were that we would have to be dealing with. And then, General Bentz, you've pointed out in these events, you have multiple different constituencies with conflicting points of view, data, and interests, and it's both political, and some of these are also highly technical. Well, that sounds like a pretty difficult problem. I think we should all resign from the case. No, I think we should try to identify what are some of the things that we could do to develop capacities in advance that would help us with that kind of truly complicated and indeed unprecedented from one generation to the next, because each of these is sort of sui generis. We know whatever we see as the next event, it won't be any of these events again. It won't be a carbon copy. It'll be something else that requires a new degree of improvisation around that. So what are some of the things you all would say that we might focus on as practitioners in your case, as academics in ours, to try to figure out how to develop additional guidance, doctrines, approaches? Where would you think that would be most helpful?
I'll jump in early because obviously these two fine scholars have much higher SAT scores than I do. But quite frankly, Joe Pfeiffer taught a block today in your session, Dutch, that I thought was profound. I've seen it before, but every time I see Joe, I learn something more. And it was the institutional bias piece, where no matter where we live in the world, no matter where we come from, we're part of institutions, of government, and how those institutions can function together and operate seamlessly will determine how our senior government officials react to the response. We all talked a little bit today about the battle of the badges, police and fire, the rivalries, the good-natured rivalries that we have in institutions. The National Guard versus the active component, quite frankly, is a rivalry that's out there, and there are institutional biases there. The sovereignty of our states and our federal government is an institutional seam. And I think if we can work those pieces, as Joe talked about today, to make sure we can solve those issues before the event happens, before landscape changes, or the Gulf of Mexico becomes a toxic waste dump. Before that happens, if we can lead turn that and have an audience like this who can go home and say, have we thought through these certain issues to avoid that breakdown of institution? I think that would be something that all of us could learn from and make our governments more functional.
One of the things we noticed, General, in this program is we've got several participants who are both the adjutant general and the state director of emergency management in their state.
My
And that's
condolences.
right. On the one hand, yes, exactly. But on the other hand, that's a level of fusion of
Absolutely.
effort that we haven't previously seen. And it's some new, so we're evolving new mechanisms for being able to do
Absolutely
this
right.
better coordination.
You bet.
General Bentz or Admiral Landry, other comments on what do you see as some of the things that we could continue to work on and improve in this domain?
So you stole my thunder,
No.
right. It's the dialoguing with the, the different communities on what they see as their territory, so the organizational bias. One of the things I got out of the the training today was this concept of this mutual adjustment, where you start out in negotiation of kind of how do you deal in family environments. It's very basic kind of communication, and that as you get more structure in an organization, you go to standard operating procedures, and you get more standardized and routine processes built. But then you get into these crises, these unusual events where those don't fit anymore, and you actually revert back to kind of that simple model of how do we deal at the most basic level, our communications and coordinations and relationships. And as I look at our efforts now in the post-Fukushima phase, what we're trying to do is really make much more simple things like, what are our standards? We should have a list, right? And it should be understood by our senior leaders. What are our best practices? Where is all of the capability? Those are very simple things for us to be doing today in order to prepare for our next event.
But it seems to me, General Bentz, you also raise a really important issue when you discuss the fact that we often want to use authority to help clarify these situations and proceed, but in the constitutional environment we're operating in, with people who aren't in the same authority hierarchy,
Right.
you can't do that, in effect. You have to negotiate or persuade. And this, Admiral Landry, must be a good characterization of part of what you lived through in Deepwater Horizon.
Right. There's two elements I thought about. First of all, it was a corporate merger on the fly, if you will. And even though you have this underpinning of you have a law and a regulation, and you have years of experience working with regional response teams, national response teams, incident command system, we have been working in this country towards a commonality or a unity of effort and an understanding. I was still surprised to find that even incident command and the doctrine and everything that's written that we've all practiced, you had different cultures there, different, as the general mentioned, different attitudes, different equities. And then I think, as complex as this spill was, there were some clear authorities, clear lanes, and then there were some overlapping jurisdictions where you have a federal and a state jurisdiction sitting right on top of each other. And state sovereignty is a big deal in our country right now because I think there's more stress on the system. There's more competing interests in our offshore environment. We deal with offshore oil and gas. We deal with fisheries. We deal with endangered right whales having to get out of shipping lanes. And so there's a lot of competing interests, and there are a lot of competing equities. So the thing I wished we could have done more beforehand is look at every federal agency with statutory equities and authorities, look at every state agency, look at the local agencies, look at the private sector, and do something similar to what the Department of Defense has done in the pre-scripted mission assignments. What are going to be the gaps? What are going to be the requirements? And let's look ahead of time at how we might work on the agreements and have everything signed on the dotted line so we can expedite that capability. I think we need the private sector to look at that for if it's a nuclear issue, if it's an oil spill, no matter what it is, if it's a communications issue. Our free enterprise system, these companies compete with each other. They're proprietary. They need to really sit down and think about how they could have prearranged agreements and bringing the necessary capabilities. And I would look at that from an all-hazard standpoint so that we're we've gone there and talked about it ahead of time. We're not sitting there trying to figure it out in the midst of the crisis, because in the midst of the crisis, they do polarize around those that I think you mentioned, Julie. They all go back to their natural polarized view, and it's very difficult then to integrate the unity of effort that's so important. The other thing I would caution on is the alignment of messaging. What I learned from Health and Human Services and CDC and the great exercises they did for H5N1, if you look at the challenges we still have today in the Gulf of Mexico, in the confusion to the general public, is the fish safe? You know, come to the beaches. At the same time, there's a community of people who are saying, we're going to still lose this ecosystem. There's a lot of mixed messages out there, and nobody knows what to believe. And I'm not saying control the message from one vantage point. I'm saying work very, very hard to align the messaging, to have the true science be speaking to one thing, have everybody agreeing on what should be said, because people are just confused. We have the best seafood testing in the Gulf that they've ever had. They went from 2 labs to 7. That seafood is tested more than seafood anywhere in the world, but there's still a concern that it could be tainted from this oil spill. So I think just the alignment of messaging, so that there's a faith in governance, there's a faith in reconstitution of a community or a state or a society or a certain entity. I think that alignment piece is key, and that was a very, very difficult challenge.
Well, I'm struck by one aspect of your answer, and I'm going to just invite the audience. We're about to go to questions from the floor, so if you have a question, we have microphones in a couple different locations down here on the floor and also up in the balconies. So please formulate your questions and bring them to the microphones, and we'll be turning to that in just a moment. And as you ready your questions for our distinguished panel, let me just, I'm struck, Admiral Landry, by the observation that you made, in effect, about the contrast between the setting you described, which was bringing these organizations together that are not hierarchically arranged and having to, in effect, negotiate and persuade and cajole and collaborate without being able to order everybody at the end to say, okay, this is what we're going to do, now everybody get in line behind that. I'm struck by that as the description of these kinds of events. And the contrast between that and our natural assumptions about the culture of U.S. military organizations. Now, military organizations, in fact, operate on a much more decentralized basis than people think. But they still do operate through command authority. And they're used to using authority as a way of clarifying who's supposed to do what, answering questions, getting decisions, and so on. So how do we prepare those organizations to operate more successfully in an environment where not only do they not have authority, but nobody else does either? You know, it's an environment where authority is really not the resource. You've got to do something else instead. So any insights about that you can help us with? How do we prepare people for that?
Well, again, no matter where we live in the world, no matter what our backgrounds are, protection of our citizenry and our communities is foremost in all of our minds, whether you're a police, fire, first response, emergency responder. And I think you bring up valid points, Dutch, but I think that when an emergency occurs, no matter where it occurs, the spirit of humanity comes to the forefront so that we begin the process. Where the rivalries occur and where the will of the governed occur is in the post response phase, and probably the recovery phase, because there's so much equity with things that are left undone, and how long are you going to expect us to stay there? Who's going to pay the bill? Who's going to work the aftermath and the cleanup? Those are the tough areas that I think that we find in the National Guard, and our Adjutant General can speak to it better than I, are very important, because there's no room for delay or response following a catastrophe, small, medium, or large.
Right.
And so you've got to get at that work quickly, not impede the first response that most of our communities have, which are very professional people, but assist where necessary, and then map out. And that's why this program at Harvard is so important. It teaches us the mapping strategies that go with the aftermath of a large-scale event. And this is interesting for us, because look at the great leaders who've gone through these challenges. You have Admiral Thad Allen, who's a world treasure in terms of his ability to deal with things. My predecessor, Steve Long, who worked with Thad during Hurricane Katrina. you have Russ Honore, who, as an active duty Army officer, quite rightly, has great expertise and his ability to work with the Red Cross. So we've got to tap into people who've been there and done that, because everybody who's never been into a major or complex catastrophe needs that mentorship, that leadership, which I really commend the people here for attending in their busy schedules to get that type of background.
Well, thank you for the vote of confidence about the program. We hope we're doing what you described.
Last year I congratulated Tufts, and I was in the wrong school, but I got it right tonight.
No, it's our sister institution. All these institutions are wonderful
Absolutely,
places.
absolutely.
But along the lines that you're describing, as you observed, if you look at the individual people that you described, Thad Allen as an example, it wasn't an accident that he had those skills. It was actually the product of a lengthy, distinguished career in which he had accumulated an enormous amount of experience and a skill set that included the ability to operate with ambiguous authority, with a lot of other people who also had authority in complicated situations. Exactly. Increasingly over his career, he had been involved as larger and larger events were his to manage. So I don't think we should think of it as just he's certainly a national treasure, but our challenge is to produce some more national treasures, okay? In fact, a continuing flow at a much higher volume of that. Yep. And so the question of how, we need to identify what those skills are, but also then to try to get careers that enhance the capacity to develop those. So,
this struggle we had with the Deepwater Horizon, everybody wanted to know who's in charge, and you say, who's in charge of what? Because if you look at our Constitution, it's as fundamental as our Constitution, and there are statutory authorities, and there are local authorities and state authorities. But the Coast Guard is this unique, nuanced military service with domestic law enforcement authorities. So we're kind of a hybrid. And I always described when we prepared to work in pandemic or we were going to work a domestic situation, collaborative leadership with a commanding presence. Because the military has that command authority. They operate under the clear lines. And I think that is a skill set that is so critical in a crisis. And I think you have to have that ability to have a commanding presence so that you can influence those with statutory equities who might need to slide a little, as we fought the debate about dispersants with the EPA and NOAA and the Coast Guard and the states and everybody who had equities in the decision. You really have to have that kind of collaborative leadership, respecting authorities, but still being able to have enough of a commanding presence that you can influence. Because you do have to influence, you do have to move the ball forward. You can't not meet the requirements of that response or that crisis.
We really are going to turn to questions from the floor, so bring your questions to the microphones. Let me just pursue this issue about, because I think that's a very interesting description that you just gave of how people need to be able to respond, and it's the beginning of a doctrine about what the skill set would be. You have to be able to negotiate and collaborate while having a form of command presence that allows you to influence people in a way to get them to agree. Thad Allen actually says that. He says there were a number of situations where he had absolutely no authority over things at all, but when he told people that was what we were going to do, they seemed to think that was, in fact, what they were going to do, and we sort of did. Yeah, yes. So absolutely. They're prepared to, maybe that's the right way to think about it, but the command presence idea, I think, is very interesting. So that's part of our challenge, is to develop a cadre of people who have these kinds of skills. Part of it also sounds like it's to develop the structures within which we can do this. But I wonder if you have other insights about what you see as some of the frontier areas here that we need to focus more on and develop more guidance about.
Well, we're working on how do you incorporate our domestic communities in an international response. That's hard because our domestic communities have gotten used to plugging into the national response framework. Well, we don't have one of those for an international response. And one of the challenges that we saw in Fukushima and a decision that was made was that the data that was coming off of those power plants belonged to the government of Japan. And even though we were capturing it and we were analyzing it, that data went back to the government of Japan, and they were the ones who released it. So you talk about authorities, you talk about the sovereignty of the nation or the state. Right. And that was a very challenging way of doing business, but it was the right way of doing it.
It sounds like you had to figure that out as you went along in this event.
Absolutely.
Admiral Landry, though, wasn't that similar with BP? They held the proprietary rights of how much oil was leaking in the Gulf. How did you get their data, and how did you validate their data? It's across all our institutions, right. the reliability of information and the trust you have with those who you're doing business with.
you do have subpoena authority. I think it is important to understand that from the beginning, the Department of Justice was involved, and we have, along with a search and rescue case and 11 lives that were lost tragically, but many were rescued. You had a search and rescue case, you had a pollution spill, and you also had a what's called a marine casualty investigation, which we initiated. But we always initiate that, and that's a civil proceeding with an understanding there could be potential criminal. And so we had, and I have the utmost confidence in our rule of law and in our system of governance that simultaneous with all that going on, the U.S. attorneys are right there, and we know what needs to be done in the course of this response. And fortunately, we have enough experience in how you have to document and how you have to record and keep records of everything that goes on, every decision that's made. So it will all come forth, and I have the utmost confidence that this will work its way through. And so we'll leave it at that for that. That's part of it, because it's still an ongoing case.
But as you and others have observed, the BP oil spill was a new spill of national significance every day.
Yes,
So it was like, we have a threshold for what we say is national significance, and this met that every day for 90 days. So
can we mention, too, it's important, the threshold we crossed when Admiral Allen was named the National Incident Commander is important. We have the stand-up of Homeland Security. We have Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5. We have the National Response Framework that used to be the plan, but they updated it after Katrina. Under this Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5, Secretary Napolitano is the leader among equals to coordinate across all the cabinet-level agencies. At the time, Secretary Napolitano. And interestingly, that design of a spill of national significance such as this says, we will name a national incident commander to represent that cabinet-level secretary who may get other things going on because of the duration of the event. Well, the day he was named the National Incident Commander, and the fire chief and I were talking about this, was the day that the bomb went off in Times Square, a car bomb that could have been much worse, heaven forbid. And I'm sitting there understanding full well we needed the National Incident Commander because we know we need the Secretary of Homeland Security to take care of other things that may happen. We went on to have floods and other things going on. So how do you keep that? And under that National Incident Commander, it is collaborating across all the statutory equities and down with the states. And Admiral Allen was perfect for it, as you say, because he has years of experience. But it didn't make it easy, I'll tell you, if you ask Admiral Allen. I mean, this was one of the tougher ones that it was tough on everybody. It was every federal agency, every state agency, every local person, the private sector. And initially, we thought BP had all the capability to meet the requirements of this because of the technologies and that, only to find out we had to pull in the Department of Energy and others to help, and the Department of Defense to help and assist in solving the problem. So really, it was unique.
I think that's a great description of the general nature of these kinds of events that we're trying to prepare people for. So we're going to go to questions. Let me say what a question is. First, a question begins by identifying yourself. Say your name and, if you want, your affiliation here. And then a question consists of a very short statement with a question mark at the end. So please, let's go first. I think you were first in line.
My name is Yusuke Saito. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I'm actually from Japan. And it's not the question, but I just wanted to say thank you for helping when we had an earthquake. Actually, 16,000 people died because of the tsunami, and also 3,000 people are still missing. And I was at the Tokyo, and I was kind of devastated by the event. But because of the like Tomodachi operation, like friendship operations, we are very, very encouraged by what you have done. So I just wanted to say thank you for everything.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's very nice of you to say. Thank you very much. We'll go to our second question.
Hi, my name is Evelyn Betcher. I'm a second-year master's student in the Regional Studies East Asia Master's Program in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences here. My question follows that previous question. It's about international cooperation and disaster response. And it's my understanding that after the disaster in Japan last spring, in addition to the very positive response to the U.S. military's role, there's a great deal of domestic attention within Japan on the SDS role as well. And so my question is, how has that how did that event change the SDF's and or other regional militaries' approaches to humanitarian and disaster response? And what are the greatest challenges that we face or in differences to that response, different approaches for future foreign military-to-military disaster and humanitarian relief operations?
Thank you. Who would like to?
Well, the National Guard, and again, I compliment the leadership in the room today. For 20 years, we've considered building partnership capacity a vital interest to our organization. What started out in the early 90s as kind of a science project, demographically affiliating states like Illinois and Poland and Maryland in the Balts, has grown into 65-nation partnership where our military-to-military relationships are vitally strong, and we do disaster response as part of our training with our military countries. So the gentlemen and ladies in the room representing their states and territories feel that that's really critical, that you know, we're kind of known for a kinetic effect, but we really value our partnerships with other foreign governments and militaries to try to learn from each other how best to approach these large-scale natural disasters. So thank you for that question.
You, other panelists, want to comment on that?
So I just wanted to ask on SDS. I know the SDF. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, so SDF stands for the self-defense force, right? So in Japan, and these were, and for the gentleman who's from Japan as well, this is kind of, my understanding is like their National Guard. It's the ones that came forward in that time and self-mobilized and did an incredible service with a lot of the research and rescue and you know, just going out and really being the added boots on the ground, much like we do here and what the National Guard provides here in America. What they found was in their response in Japan, they worked really well with our military. And so it turned out that we were able to, you know, put them on our helicopters, on our airplanes, on our boats, and move them around as necessary. And the relationships built, they came over and gave us a kind of a one-year readout on, you know, their lessons learned from that response. And they were incredibly open with us and sharing kind of where their gaps and seams were and what their challenges that they uncovered were. And so we have an incredibly tight and focused bilateral engagement with them, looking at these pieces because, you know, some of their challenges are our challenges as well.
Absolutely. It's a very, very important set of issues. To the microphone down here, Jim Featherstone.
Good evening. Jim Featherstone. I'm the emergency manager from the city of Los Angeles. And I just wanted to say, General, it's been a pleasure working with your board of directors this week.
Great.
I've learned a lot.
Fantastic.
My question is, the Guard in California has been working on the Civil Support Task List. And to my understanding is it begins to categorize and quantify Guard capability for the support of civil authorities, very similar to what you do with your warfighting capability. Is that a Guard-wide issue, or is it regional?
It's really kind of a whole-of-government approach, but for us in the National Guard, we have these scalable programs that start with small organizations called civil support teams. Governor Brown obviously has 2 in California, and they can rapidly deploy to assist in the identification of unknown substances, and then you build and scale upwards to what we consider a Homeland Response Force package of 700 plus soldiers and airmen. So that's a credit to Paul Stockton and the Quadrennial Defense Review that occurred previous to the one we're starting now to partner with the National Guard, with our states and our FEMA regions, because really the evolution of our relationship with emergency management has been profound, and I know the Coast Guard has led the way in how that relationship is built. But these scalable teams that train, organize, equip themselves to be responsive to the governor's needs, the mayor's needs of our respective cities are vitally important in today's environment, and we think they will be for decades to come.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Let's go to the microphone up here, and then we'll come down.
My name is Peter Grogan. I'm a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee. And in light of the current budget concerns, how do you see our role in aiding foreign disasters changing?
Didn't take long to get to the budget, did it? No. I'm surprised it took this long. I should have mentioned in my opening remarks. The country obviously wants to reduce our expenditures, and Admiral Mullen, our former chairman, called it our number one national security problem is our debt. So the challenge is resources, but I've not seen our government shrink or the support for response to out-of-country issues get smaller as a result of budgetary considerations. I know Mr. Brennan, who you work with, who advises the president, there's been no discussion of can we support this or not. We do it. We find the resources later. I hope we are always able to do that. But these events are very costly, and Admiral Landry, I'll let you talk about it.
I think it's interesting. We had a meeting before we came down here. We had a collegial get-together, and we all looked at each other and said, we have to continue to find the efficiencies. And we all know that. We're very committed, working with the FEMA regions. Absolutely. And we have a defense coordinating officer footprint there. We have NORTHCOM. We have all these capabilities, and we have to continue to find the most efficient and effective and cost-effective way to bring those capabilities to bear. So, we could say when the Secretary Napolitano and others had that discussion that first week with the White House on the line and Secretary of Defense, there was a serious discussion, should this be Stafford Act? If this were Stafford Act, if we had done a natural disaster crisis, the government would have paid and then billed the BP later. That would have taken years, and it's very interesting. Nobody sitting there that day anticipated a $20 billion response. I'm telling you, none of us really thought in those terms. But I think back to your point of what can we do for whether it's domestic or overseas assistance, I think our obligation, and we are all very conscious of our deficit and what Chairman Mullen said, our obligation is to continue to find ways to do it the most efficient, effective way, because we are not going to have the luxury of resources. And even looking and tapping into DOD, you could say, we should give federal and state capabilities that mirror DOD. Well, the whole purpose of this barrage that you see is because we cannot afford to equip the Department of Defense and equip the Fire Department in New York and equip the state police. We can't afford to have everybody have this suite of capabilities that overlap, and we have to find a way to find those efficiencies and the effectiveness and reduce that duplication.
So fair enough, recognizing the importance of the efficiencies, these events don't really allow for the form of sort of formal planning ahead of time for how much resources there are. The events happen, and you basically have to make commitments to respond, and we do, and then you have to try to figure out where the resources are going to come from. It just seems to me it's the nature of the beast.
Yeah, last year, 14 natural disasters in the United States, each costing over $1 billion. Craig Fugate just struggles with the scope of the tornadoes, the floods, the fires, the things that are happening to us, and these are weather events, and hopefully we'll come out of this pattern, but it doesn't look like it.
200-year flood I had before I left my district, the 200-year floods on the Mississippi. And I think where FEMA was very forward-leaning after Katrina, because we learned a lesson there, don't wait for the state to ask. As you go to be forward-leaning with those resources, how do you afford that? It is a struggle, and it's a struggle for the states, and I think as they have to pull back and not offer as much up front and put the burden on the states budgets are challenged. I mean, we have a global financial challenge. I think other countries.
There's one silver lining, and that is when we get to the table and talk capabilities and budget, it's amazing how little what we call inside the Beltway rice bowl issues there are, in that people are looking for ways to partner so that they are not obligated for so much. And so it's actually a good news story, because they're willing to share and talk and communicate and get to those efficiencies in a way that I've not ever seen before.
And the states have agreements among themselves, and they work through things ahead of time. I think the private sector, I keep pressing that, because so much of our critical infrastructure in this country is owned by the private sector. We really have to encourage the private sector to partner like that, even though they compete with each other. You know, these companies, they need to do the same kinds of things that we have been doing for the last several years.
But I think this is a really interesting insight that the budget pressure itself is forcing a form of collaboration and exploration for abilities to work together, which has lots of other benefits if you hear the earlier part of our discussion. So that's very helpful. Bert Tussing.
Hi, Bert Tussing, United States Army War College. Admiral Landry, you touched upon something which has been a frequent amount of our discussion this week, the importance of strategic communications in the process of our preparing for, first of all, responding to as necessary and recovering from disaster. My question for you is what happens when we go to the next level, when we go beyond disaster, when we go to catastrophe, when we approach what Administrator Fugate is calling the maximum of maximums, when we approach the complex catastrophes that DoD is now working very, very hard to approach. What do we tell the people? How do we prepare them? You all know very well that we go frequently very far out of our way to let them know that government will handle things quickly, efficiently, effectively. But, for instance, God forbid that the New Madrid fault should occur, there's nothing that we can do that's going to soften the blow. So what do we do to make our people the vital factor of resilience for the country when the time comes?
I think Administrator Fugate and Secretary Napolitano, and the folks are very focused on trying to manage American people's expectations. I watch Florida, and the governor says you have to have 72 hours worth of goods, and they start complaining at 24, where's my water, where's my whatever, when they have a hurricane. We have to change the culture in this country because we're a little bit spoiled, and we're a little bit entitled. We have this entitlement attitude, like the government should give us what we need now. But by the way, we want to reduce government, and we want, it's too big, and I mean, so I think I applaud the work they are trying to do now to have every American be ready to take care of themselves, to have every community, whether it's a city or a county or a state, be more resilient and capable as they learn the lessons of Katrina and go forward. And when they help with disasters, they always are working on that, build yourself stronger, build your capabilities better. The same kinds of, if we reinvest because of the Stafford Act disaster, how do we build it more resilient and make them more capable? If you looked at the floods that we went through, the 200-year floods, they had floods the last few years, and those communities did a great job of being more capable, more ready to withstand the challenges. So I think we've got to have a campaign in this country for, you know, we just really have a lot of wonderful we live in a lap of luxury in this country, and we really need to start to understand what it would be like to go without. And the one thing I don't ever want is martial law. You know, we worried after 9/11 if we had a Chem Bio incident, you know, would we ever have to go to martial law? And you saw in Katrina, you know, this kind of thing. And I actually saw the ruminations of it in the BP spill. I said to Governor Chris, thank you for being a team player as we waited for the president. He said, oh, Mary, it was just politics. I said, this went beyond politics. And I said, and I was really worried about a hurricane coming, no cap there yet, and there were people fighting over resources. So you really concern yourself with that we don't want to have to go to martial law in this country. We want to be able to, you know, withstand that kind of challenge. So.
And I think we need to challenge ourselves in our exercise preparation too more. I've talked a little bit in the green room about it. Many of our adjutants general have talked about it. We plan and compete in an exercise program where we know the desired outcome, and when we reach it, we stop. The New Madrid event, there's no stopping, and we will go to failure. Institutions and all of us will be pressed to the limits. We'll depend on our international partners to help because this will be very much a landscape-changing event. Liquefaction of the ground, I'm a fighter pilot, I didn't know what it was, but when the ground turns to liquid, that's how bad the 1811, 1812 New Madrid fault earthquake was. Google it. It will scare you because it will split this nation in half. We can only dream or be part of a large-scale catastrophe to even understand what that challenge will be to all of us. We should exercise ourselves to the point of failure. And I wish we could do that, because I think the lessons learned out of that would save lives in the long run if we have the event.
So this puts on us another couple of issues. One is the exercising out past the threshold.
Yes.
And the other is the messaging to the public to recognize that there's a type of event that's different than these sort of routine within the threshold events in which we can expect success all the time.
Absolutely.
And that failure doesn't mean that somebody did a bad job. It just means the event is such. So we have time for one or possibly two more questions, and then I'm going to ask each of our panelists if he or she has a final benediction to offer us. So please.
I'm Naim, the Fire Chief of Bangladesh. I know, General, you just said that you are obligatory, or you have the obligation to save life of the U.S. citizen anywhere where they are. And you have the obligation also to save life, a human life, if they are in major disaster. So your presence was there in Japan. You did a miracle thing, and my hats off to you. And even the Coast Guard did a splendid job once the BP oil spilling was there. So in both the incidents, we find Dutch has taught us that these are noble crises. So but your focus in South Asian countries is not, as yet we have seen, that is not a major focus that you are rendering or giving consideration. But your citizens are there, you have the obligations, so I feel that you will definitely going for help in case of such novel crisis. So my question is, how you think that all of a sudden you cannot go, because in Japan you did a miracle because your presence was there, but not in South Asian region. What is your priority to develop the relationship, bilateral relationship with the countries of South Asia, or there is a regional organization called SARC is not that effective? Do you feel that you have a certain role to play to get it activated so that your response would be much quicker, easier to handle the situation? And about this Home Guard, also the organization dealing with BP oil spill. This was a noble crisis, and the Coast Guard did the operation, but the operation was shifted from Homeland Security to possibly to Environmental Department. Exactly, I am not very sure why it was shifted. However, whatever is the reason, could be a political reason also, but this experience of yours can be shared with the rest of the countries, because even in South Asian countries, you will find that the offshore drilling for oil is going on. Yeah. The route can be disrupted. The situation could be a combination of situations like earthquake and the oil spill as well.
Well, thank you.
So do you have any plan of exchanging these ideas so that noble crisis doesn't noble again and again? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think you've managed to ask both of our last two questions. So,
Julie's
So I have to tell you, I'm a member of the Oregon National Guard, and we have a state partnership program with Bangladesh. So I'm very, very pleased that you answered this question. As you will know, that the Guard has many state partnerships, many with the South Asian countries. Like I said, the Oregon Guard is partnering with your country. And I would say that when it comes to humanitarian aid, disaster response, it's core to our
American ethos.
Our ethos. Thank you. That's a good word. And we always have within the U.S. Agency for International Development and the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance a ready and a group of professionals ready to go for any of the great disasters that occur anywhere in the world. So,
and President Obama has told us in our national level exercises to be prepared not only at home, but anywhere in the world that we're needed and where we're asked, and to be available and ready. Those are high, lofty goals for us in agencies to be prepared for a worldwide response, but I can assure you it's high on our President's list of priorities for us.
I think it's a really interesting question, though, because if we come back to our earlier discussion, we said how we could prepare for this domestically is that we need to create these relationships in advance. So you're not, as with the famous story of handing out cards at the event. So I think the challenge here is for to make the same level of commitment in terms of building those relationships abroad. And the state level interactions between National Guard and other countries is a good start of that. General Aylward, in our discussion earlier this week, said that he thought what we ought to, in this program, involve some of the counterpart countries that are your partners abroad, and to bring people from those agencies into the same kind of program. So it's in the same sort of spirit.
We talk about exchange students at our colleges, our Army War College, Navy War College, you know, exchange students, and also we do the capstone program when we all get to the level of executive. I was in Nepal and in Thailand and Malaysia, and we visit, and some go to the South American countries, some go, we go around the world. We try to touch globally. It is a reality that we are all experiencing fiscal shortages. Hopefully the globe fiscal situation will improve in a few years, and we will survive this challenge. And so it waxes and wanes in terms of our ability to engage. But the I'll never forget the relationships you build, even when you go to school together here. You make friendships that are lasting, and it is understood that you should stay in touch with each other and build these relationships, because at this level, then they become the leaders in their country. And so I think there's different touch points beyond just the program of the sponsorship of the National Guard, and we are very committed to continuing those touch points and those relationships with the countries around the world.
Thanks, General Olstrom, for bringing this together this week where we can all share and talk to each other.
Be in the same room, indeed.
Thank you very much.
Yes, indeed. And Admiral Landry, did you want to comment on the Deepwater Horizon EPA?
I should mention, too, BP is a global company. The companies that do drilling around the world are global companies, and there are not as many companies as everyone would think. Some countries have their own companies, but we recognize drilling goes on around the world, and these companies do ask us or reach out to us and ask us to participate with them in exercises. So the globe becomes very small for things like energy and nuclear. We become a very small community of experts or people that are willing to support you. So what a promise I think we can collectively make is, no matter what type of challenge you may meet, we will find the expertise within our country to assist, and we will even find the expertise in the private sector and globally to assist, hopefully. I mean, hopefully. A rising tide lifts all boats. That's what they say in the Coast Guard. A rising tide lifts all boats.
The Coast Guard believes that very, very strongly. And that's maybe a good note on which to bring our questions to an end. And I want to come back and ask each of the panelists, just give each of them a moment to, suppose you were addressing a sizable group of already senior but still emerging leaders in emergency management and disaster response from the United States and affiliated agencies and from around the world, because that is what you are doing. That is who is here in front of you today. What would you tell this group about how they might continue to prepare, the things that they could work on, a final thought that you might have about coming out of our conversation tonight? General Bentz, why don't we start with you?
So a final thought that I would give you to think about, we talked about the 200-year flood. We've talked about, you know, the 1,000-year earthquake. I have evidence that in my world, I've got a once-in-a-generation kind of catastrophe using my people of the nuclear technical community. And I wonder how we can encode these episodic events in a way that we don't lose the knowledge. I think this is more than just training and exercise. I think it's deeper than that. You know, you look at, in Fukushima, there was this stone marker. You guys remember that? A stone marker there that stated, do not build below this level. And it was put, what, 400, 500 years ago? I mean, how do we encode for those once in a lifetime, once in 200 years, once in a 1,000-year event in a way that we can pass our knowledge forward?
Excellent. Thank you very much. Mayor Landry.
Well,
Admiral Landry.
Right. I would just say, even though these are different categories and different expertise, it's the same. It's you know, all hazards, if you will, all challenges. And I think we are all in this together. So I would encourage everyone to develop a passion for what I call very purposeful work, the work of preparing for the next crisis. And don't think it's unimportant to your day-to-day, whatever you're doing. It's not, because it is scalable. You will use the skill sets. You just have to promise that you will go forward, thinking outside the box a little bit about what could happen and how you will contribute. How can I contribute? How can I be a part of the solution and a part of the team? because we find that it is a very small group of we're all the same people that show up at these things. Haiti, you know, no matter what it is, we're all the same group of people. We all need to be a part of this because you're all here now, you're all listening, you're all interested, so you're a part of it. And I would say going forward, continue to hone your skills, explore the possibilities, and think of it in terms of all hazards. No matter what it is, they're the same things that will be needed.
Once you're beyond the threshold, it feels pretty similar, no matter what's the specific event.
That's right. Once you're in this, you're in it for life.
General McKinley.
Dutch, thanks again for the opportunity to be here at the Kennedy School. I'd like to thank the Adjutant General and their representatives for what they do, and they make my job easy. This is probably one of the last few times I'm with them, and I appreciate all the great support they've given us. In my recent leadership history, I can recall 3 things which have been labeled failures, and nobody in this room ever wants to fail. We wouldn't be here tonight if we didn't want to learn and be better and never be labeled failures. But there was a failure of imagination, as Richard Ben-Minister called it in the 9/11 Commission, that our nation missed signals. We weren't thinking outside the realm, and we potentially cost ourselves time, trouble, and lives. So imagine the things that can happen. I don't think we ever imagined a BP oil spill either. But we have to. We are all in the business of trying to think of the possibilities that can occur that will require us to put a plan into action. Secondly, in Katrina, it wasn't the hurricane that caused the disaster. It was the failure of the man-made levees. That's what Dad taught me. It was the aftermath of the event that we weren't prepared for, and we threw everything and the kitchen sink towards fixing it. Pete was there, others in this room were there. And so the initiative was there, but it failed to produce the outcome we wish we could have had, and the President became the action officer for Hurricane Katrina. For those of us in the military, that's the wrong approach, but it happened. And then finally, today, we see across our spectrum our institutions and people criticizing them as institutions are failing. Government institutions are failing. Corporate institutions are failing. I would suggest that we're not in as bad a shape as we may see, but we could build a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we don't believe our institutions will work, then we've set ourselves on a very slippery slope. And I would encourage everybody who's in this room today to go back and strengthen the institution in which you work so that we can do a better job and be more productive and be more synergistic as we go forward.
Well, thank you, General McKinley. And General, this is your second tour in the forum, and
yes.
Maybe one of the last times you get to gather the Adjutants General and others here under your watch, but we hope it won't be the last time that you come to visit us at the Kennedy School and the forum. Admiral Landry, this is not at all your first time at the Kennedy School. You were here both as a National Security Fellow and in one of our programs, and we hope you will come again many times. General Bentz, I think this may be your first tour here, but we hope it will be only one of many. And I just want to say in just a few final thoughts. First, as I said to many of you here assembled this week, you all are the answer to our prayers. I think the group that is assembled in this room is the best hope we have for being able to take on the challenges that yet lie ahead of us. We've made a lot of progress under the tutelage and watch of these 3 panelists and their compatriots in the various agencies. We've made a lot of progress. We are very different today than we were even 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, we produced better responses than we were thought to be producing. But today, for example, the response to Hurricane Irene, I think, is nothing short of brilliant. And hasn't been really talked about that way, but I think we need to bring more attention to that. So we've made a lot of progress. But as you've laid out before us, there is a lot of work still yet to do. And so you are the best hope we have for continuing to make progress on these issues. Our very best hope is the people and the organizations and the agencies that are in this room. And that's why, General McKinley in particular, we are so pleased to have the opportunity to work with the group that you've brought us. We're delighted by and very grateful for the vote of confidence that places in us, for the ability to convene this conversation, and we hope to support the making of additional progress in this direction, because we don't think that there are more important problems than these. There may be equally important problems that are thought about in this building, but there are not more important problems. The issues of these landscape-scale disasters are career and life-defining events for the people who live through them. And if we can continue to make progress on that, we will have reinvented fire, because there's still yet very good work to do. So we're very grateful for the opportunity. I thank all of you all for coming out tonight and for your questions and for your engagement with this issue and for all of the good work that you will yet do. Our final hope for you is that all your future emergencies will be entirely routine, but we can't guarantee that for you, and we hope that we'll make progress on all of these. Please join me in thanking our panelists tonight for being with us.